The next question is, how does Canada select refugees to come here? Can you describe the checks that refugees have to pass to Canada?
I will say a few things and then any other fellow panelists can add. So when people flee their countries, they go to another country, they become refugees. So in many cases, they are being assisted by United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And thousands of refugees are there on the ground. So at some point, and they keep arriving on a daily basis. At some point, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which we call sometimes UNHCR, will make referral to one of those 28 countries, as we heard in the video, who welcome refugees. Based on, we saw some of the example of the video, based on vulnerability, a single mother with children, an elderly person. And then after UNHCR makes this referral to one of those 28 countries, Canada could be one of them, and Canada will either accept or refuse the referral. And if they accept it, they will then conduct a screening. So the screening is done on 3 levels, 3 grounds, and we saw some of it also in the video. One has to do with health. Is that person healthy enough to come to Canada, at least now? If not, what should we do about it? Second, one screening has to do with criminal background. There's one of the databases we saw earlier indicate that this person has involved in crimes against humanity or terrorism in the past. And if this is the case, Canada will not bring this person to Canada even if you are a refugee. And the third level screening, we call it security. Somebody may not have a criminal record, somebody may not show on the databases as someone who committed crimes, but what has this person been posting online? What is this person's ideology? So they will do a very thorough screening on those 3 levels until Canada is satisfied to bring this person to Canada.
If I may add just a few comments. So first of all, when you cross the border to another country and you become a refugee, you don't just become, you're not just declared a refugee. The first instance is that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has to determine that you are a protected person and you are a refugee. So the UN puts you through interviews for sometimes running into a couple of days. I know Sean has done this work before and she may be able to answer this question much better. But you go through a couple of days and the registration may take a number of days, and sometimes for you to get the feedback as having been approved as a registered refugee may take a couple of months, sometimes even years, in my experience, as people live through this struggle of being a refugee. And once you're determined as a refugee and you are in the protection of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, every year, governments in the Western world who are resettling, the maps that we saw, they submit a quota that they resettle, they are likely to resettle into their own countries, a certain number. For example, Canada may say, this year, we're interested in resettling 6,000 refugees as government-assisted refugees to Canada. And then with that number, the UNHCR submits a certain number to Canada, and then the Canadian government takes it over from there. There are a couple of things. Number one is what we saw in the video that talks about the vulnerable situations of the groups and women, elderly, or people who are in extreme need of protection because they're even their life is not guaranteed even in the refugee camp because they're likely to be persecuted in the camps even. The second thing is that Canada sometimes may adopt a certain policy to resettle a certain group of people. For example, from refugees from a certain country. We had recently refugees from Bhutan who were in Nepal, who have lived there for a long time, and Canada took the responsibility to resettle a huge chunk of Bhutanese refugees. We had the Korean refugees from Burma. And now we have the Syrian refugees. So Canada makes a policy to resettle those refugees from those countries, and then While doing this, they also apply the second level of screening, which is vulnerable people, people in need of protection, all these kind of things. The third thing that I'll say is that the levels of screening, the ones that involve medical screening, refugees are screened for communicable diseases. Diseases that when people get here, they're likely to pass on to other people. That does not automatically disqualify them from coming to Canada. Once they're discovered to have maybe, for example, tuberculosis, they're sent for treatment, they go for treatment, and once they are cured, then their resettlement resumes and they come here. Also, if women are pregnant and they're in late pregnancy, they cannot fly, then they're told to go deliver, and then after that add the child into the process, which may delay the process, and then they are likely to come here. So these are a couple of things that refugees go through before they get here, but it's a very, very stringent process before you actually get here. The UN puts you through a lot of screening, tons and tons of questions to determine whether you actually are a refugee. And then after that, you get to the visa officer in Canada, at the Canadian Embassy, who puts you through hundreds of questions to determine your eligibility and whether what you're saying is true, in addition to all the security screening.
I'm just going to add a few little points to link together what's been said. So if you remember at the beginning I said that Canada signed the 1951 Refugee Convention. That means that refugees who flee their homes and come to Canada and say, hey, I'm a refugee, go through a Canadian process to see if they meet that refugee definition. So the UN doesn't do it, Canada does it. In certain countries, they haven't signed the Refugee Convention. They don't have an obligation to accept refugees. Some would argue they still should. We're still doing international law. But they don't, and so they allow the United Nations to be there and give what's called mandate refugee status. So then the UN is doing what Abdi described, going through this process and looking at refugees. And what you have is, my favorite term on this is the tyranny of geography. And what that means is certain parts of the world get lots and lots and lots of refugees, and other parts of the world that are surrounded by oceans in the Arctic and the US, for example, don't get that many refugees. So what the UN does in those situations where there are too many refugees for one country to handle, and you have states of what are called protraction, so that's the image of the refugee camps with too many people in them, and not a sustainable process. What the UN does is they look for durable solutions for people, and they look at local integration. So can the refugees stay where they are and locally integrate and have a life there? Can they repatriate, have the situation in their home country change so that they can return home? And if neither of those are an option, then they look at resettlement, moving them to a third country such as Canada that's willing to take them. When they look at resettlement, they said in the video that 1 to 2% of Syrian refugees are being resettled. That's actually a very high number. And the global refugee population, which I'm not even sure the total number at this point, it's over 14 million. Less than 1% of that population is actually accepted for resettlement on a yearly basis. So it's a drop in the bucket. It's a very small group. And as a personal note, I used to do resettlement referrals for the UNHCR in India to the Canadian High Commission, and I would spend time, I would do personal interviews, I'd give the Canadian High Commission this pile of documents about a person, and as a Canadian lawyer doing all this, the Canadian visa officer would then start from scratch again. And so there is this sort of overlapping, doubling, checking, just to make sure those screenings are there and the identities are clear and we know who we're bringing in.
Sorry, there's one thing we need to add. So the question was, how does Canada select refugees? So far you have understood that some of the refugees are referred to Canada by United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Some of these refugees come here in Canada either legally or illegally and then put a claim for asylum. But also, people who are here, friends, relatives, can also submit an application to sponsor refugees they know from overseas. When Canada receives that application, they will conduct the usual screening for all of them, and then if they are satisfied with the sponsor and the refugees, they will allow these refugees to come to Canada. So 3 groups of them.